Hello, and welcome back to Mammalian Anatomy at Keuka College. Today we're going to be concluding our discussion on Chapter 12, Fundamentals of the Nervous System and Nervous Tissue. And we're going to be discussing Part 4, Neural Integration. And more specifically, we're going to talk about neural circuits. So we learned already that the nervous system or the neurons specifically do not work in isolation. Rather, they're going to synapse together and communicate with each other to create a specific response to a given stimulus. We created the foundation for understanding neural integration when we talked about reflexes. And in that, we saw a sensory neuron synapse with an interneuron, and that interneuron synapsed with a motor neuron, allowing for the body to create a patterned autonomic response to a given stimulus. That was kind of showing the basic understanding of how there are neural circuits within the nervous system. And we saw that only one neuron synapsed with another neuron, and that's it, just in one, you know? But neural circuits or neuronal circuits can be much more complicated than that. And I'm so excited for this section. I'm gonna geek out a bit. And here, we're going to kind of prepare the foundations for chapter 13 and 14 when we look at more complex tracts in the brain and the spinal cord. And we're going to learn eventually how different neurons synapse together to be able to detect pain, touch, pressure, all those sorts of things in the future. But for now, we just need to learn the more vocabulary to get us to that point. So bear with me until those chapters. Okay, let's talk about neuronal circuits. Okay, the connection between neurons is so beautifully complex because rather than just having one neuron connect to another neuron and kind of just be in a single file line, we can actually have some branching structures that can allow for a single stimulus to create a much more diverse, coordinated response. So that is really cool. I think this is just amazing because these neural circuits allow us to do complex things such as walk and ride a bike, talk to each other, and my favorite is it allows us to do research and learn about neural circuits using our own neural circuits. So that is so meta. And so as I always say, for the science, it's just, I geek out. So that's my little rant about how cool this is, because it's just so amazing to see like biomechanics and see the overlap of studying anatomy and engineering and bringing it together into physiology. It's just amazing. So, but we'll get into the more geeky stuff later. Let's focus on just some definitions right now. Okay, so the nervous system is going to have three major types of circuits that exist. It's going to be divergent, convergent, and reverberating circuits. So let's go through each and every one of these. And later on, we're going to talk about different types of processing that can occur. So divergent circuits are going to have essentially a single neuron that's going to have multiple collateral axons kind of coming off of it. So we have an axon, and then it will branch into collaterals, and those collaterals can synapse to multiple other neurons. And so rather than just synapsing to a single neuron like we saw in the reflex arcs, we see it branching and connecting to multiple neurons. Because of this branching ability, we can actually stimulate multiple effector organs in response to a single stimulus and create a much more complex coordinated response. So let's say we see a tiger, for example. My alma mater of RIT has a mascot of tigers, so that's why I use it. Let's say we see a tiger and we get really scared. What's going to happen is there's actually going to be these divergent circuits that are going to go through the body, and it's going to help stimulate many different reflexes as a result of that stimulus. We may increase our breathing rate and depth of respiration. We may increase our heart rate and contractility in our circulatory system. Our palms may get sweaty, and we may have goosebumps, or we may get really pale as we get nervous seeing that tiger. So all of those things are going to be a coordinated response. So it is really cool. In the example that I'm going to give, we're going to look at the stretch reflex again, but we're going to look at a much more complicated, well, not that much more complicated. We're going to look at a diagram that is a little bit more involved right here. So over here, what we see again in the stretch reflex is that we're hitting the patellar ligament with a hammer. And when we do that, the quadricep muscles are getting stretched. And in response to that stretch, we have a receptor that will detect it, and it will convert that stretch into an electrical signal. That electrical signal is going to be passed through this sensory neuron and be brought to the integration center within the spinal cord. So all of that is the same. What's going to be different here is we're going to see the integration center will be a little bit more complex. We saw before when we talked about the stretch reflex is that the sensory neuron will directly synapse with the motor neuron in a monosynaptic reflex, but we can see another synapse occurring as well. Over here, we're seeing an example of a divergent circuit. The axon of the sensory neuron will actually branch and have collaterals, and these collaterals will actually synapse with multiple neurons. Here it's going to synapse directly with the motor neuron, and here we're going to have it synapsing with an interneuron, and then again to a motor neuron. So here we have a monosynaptic reflex, and here we have a polysynaptic reflex within this kind of same structure. So what are these going to do, and how is it going to allow for a more complex signaling system or a more complex response? So this monosynaptic reflex is going to do the same thing that we saw before. The sensory neuron is going to activate the motor neuron, and that motor neuron will carry that information to the quadricep muscles, stimulating the quadricep muscles to contract and causing the knee to pop up. But we can see that there is going to be something happening with the hamstring muscles that are antagonistic or antagonists to the quadricep muscles. Here, then a sensory neuron with this collateral is going to synapse with an interneuron, and this interneuron will actually inhibit the motor neuron that goes to the hamstring muscles. So this is going to be an inhibitory signal. That's why they are representing it with a dotted line. So it's stopping any signal going from the hamstring. And so this will allow the hamstring to relax and allow the knee to extend. So the quadriceps will be stimulated to contract. Signaling will stop going to the hamstrings, allowing the hamstrings to relax. And both of these will allow the knee to extend. This process of allowing the one neuron to to fire and inhibiting the other one is called reciprocal inhibition, and it allows for this motion to occur easier. So what you can already see is that even the stretch reflex that we talked about very simply can be more complicated, and we can have a better response when we have more complex neural circuitry. The knee will have a much easier time extending when we have one nerve being stimulated, one motor nerve being stimulated, and another motor nerve being inhibited. So this particular area is showing a really good example of three different things: a monosynaptic reflex, a polysynaptic reflex, and divergent circuit located here. Okay. Let's go on to a different type of circuit. We also have convergent circuits. Here is when many neurons will come together and synapse with a single neuron. We're not going into so much physiology yet, because I'm going to save that for vertebrate phys, but I did want to briefly introduce the concept of summation. So a single stimulus going to a neuron and being picked up by the dendrites or the cell body may not be enough to initiate an action potential in that neuron. Sometimes you need multiple stimuli to be able to initiate an action potential. So sometimes one stimulus isn't enough, you need more than one, and they have to sum up to get to an action potential. There's another concept that we learned a little bit before about. We learned about excitatory stimuli and inhibitory stimuli when we talked about chemical synapses. Some of these nerves will send an excitatory signal, and it will tell this one neuron, yes, I do want to have an action potential. So I'm going to stimulate you to get closer to that action potential and make it easier for that to happen. So that would be an excitatory stimulus. But there can also be inhibitory stimulus. This would be like, no, no, no. I don't want you to have an action potential. I'm actually going to make it more difficult for you to have an action potential. And so we can have excitatory or yes votes for an action potential, or inhibitory or no votes for an action potential. And all of these neurons that are kind of converging on this single neuron is making a vote whether or not this neuron will fire. And so it can help process much more complicated signals, and it can help determine whether or not it's an important time to experience a stimulus or not. So that would be an example of convergence circuit, and convergent circuits, are useful because they can allow for neurons to vote and determine whether or not this neuron fires in a process called summation. An example of that where you may sense a signal or not is the thalamus is a good way of filtering information that comes in from our external environment. So probably as you've been sitting here, you may not have been feeling like your sweater or t-shirt on your arms, because the thalamus the thalamus doesn't think it's important, and so it's not sending that information on, and it's not firing information or sending signals to our conscious part of our brain. So for the longest time, you probably haven't been feeling your shirt on your arms. But now that we're discussing it and it is part of the conversation, there are a lot more yes votes to send that information to the conscious part of our brain. And so you probably are feeling that stimulus a little bit easier. Another location where we're going to have some convergent circuits, it's going to be in the retina of the eye. So just finding my cursor, where did it go? So on this diagram, there we go. On this diagram, you can see the rods. The rods are a type of photoreceptor or light receptor that are located in the retina. And these rods are responsible for seeing in the dark and for seeing motion, and it lacks the ability to see color. There are a different type of photoreceptor called cones that have the capability of detecting color. You'll see that multiple rods will actually synapse together into one bipolar cell. And this bipolar cell will be told by these three different rods whether or not it should fire or not. And so then it will determine, okay, is this an appropriate time to have an action potential or not? We can see this convergence, again, continuing with the bipolar cell and the ganglia. These bipolar cells will then synapse with a ganglia and then determine whether or not this ganglia should fire at that time. Is it an appropriate time for that ganglion to fire? This ganglion cell is important because its axon will actually become the optic nerve and send that information into the brain. So here you can see we start out with many receptor cells, the rods, and we're slowly kind of processing that information down to the ganglia, and the ganglia will have to determine whether or not it's an appropriate time to have an action potential and send that information to the brain. So lots of voting is going on here. The third type of stimulus or circuit is going to be a reverberating circuit. Reverberating is kind of like what we experience when we have feedback on our meetings. The information is coming out of the speakers, going into the microphone and kind of looping back and forth, and it's getting louder and squeakier and those sorts of things. That would be an example of reverberation. Here in the nervous system, we can have reverberating fibers as well. So what can happen is there could be like a group of neurons that are connected together in like a single file line. And then what will happen is one of those neurons will actually have a collateral that can come back and stimulate another nerve that will stimulate the neurons in upstream to that signal. So we have a signal going this way, and eventually the signal will loop back and can either inhibit that neuron or it can stimulate that neuron. And this is really awesome because it can lead to a positive or negative feedback. These types of reverberating circuits are often used in rhythmically controlled patterns, so such as breathing and swinging our arms while we walk. So it will allow for that pattern to move and sway back and forth, back and forth. So that goes over the three different types of circuits. We have diverging circuits, converging circuits, and reverberating circuits. In the next section, we're going to talk about a different type of processing. There's two types of processing. There is serial processing and then parallel processing. Serial processing is going to be similar to what we saw when we talked about reflexes. There's going to be a set of neurons that are going to synapse in a single file line, and they're going to communicate one neuron then to another neuron and so on and so forth, almost like a domino effect. And because of this, the response that occurs occurs to the stimulus is going to be very predictable, and it's going to be all or none. You're going to have that response, and it's going to be the expected response. So it's going to be the simplest type of processing that we're going to have. Parallel process. Oh, here. So over here, this diagram is going to show an example of serial processing. You're going to just have one neuron communicating with the next neuron, and eventually you'll get to an effector organ and tell the effector organ to do a particular thing. So not so complex, very predictable, kind of one way, all or none kind of signaling. You're either going to have the response or you're not going to have the response. Type is parallel processing, and this is where we get to all of the cool stuff, or at least starting the cool stuff. Here, a single nerve is going to split, and information is going to be sent along 2 or more pathways, and this is going to allow for that complex response. So your book gives an example of seeing a friend walking, and so if you see your friend walking towards you, you're receiving a particular stimulus from in the form of light, and the retina is picking that up and sending it to the brain. But what will happen is there'll be some parallel processing that will occur, and the neurons will form like divergent circuits that will send that information to different parts of the brain. And so one part of the brain is going to process the color of your friend's shirt that they're wearing today, how fast that they're walking or running, how quickly are they coming towards you, their spatial location, are they walking on the sidewalk or are they walking in the middle of the street, or how far are they away from you. Another set of circuits is going to help you recognize your friend's face, how they walk, their name, and those sorts of things. And there also will be information coming in from not only from your eyes, there'll also come information in from your memory that will integrate with this kind of parallel process to create a more complex understanding of what's going on. So, and that all of these things will come together to influence your response to your friend. So if you're in a good mood and you're having a great day and it's all sunny and stuff, you may like give your friend a hug and like be like, hey, I missed you, it's so great. But like if your friend like stole your cupcake like 2 days ago and you're still not over that, you may be like, hi, and be a little upset at them. And so you're taking this information from your environment and from your memories and bringing them together to create a particular response. So much coolness, so much excitement. I hope you're geeking out with me just how beautiful the nervous system is when it comes to processes and circuits and integration and all sorts of things. Well, that ends our lecture. And so what we're going to do is we're going to finish this chapter 12. I want you to study. You have your learning objectives list now on Moodle. So go through that, study each of the components and ask questions. And then next week, we're going to get into chapter 12 and chapter 13 and 14, where we're going to kind of briefly introduce the brain and the spinal cord and some of the tracks and pathways that go through the central nervous system. Okay, have a great day and be good to yourselves. Bye-bye.